Early in my ministry, I knew a man who went in to have routine heart surgery, and something went seriously wrong. He survived the surgery, but following that, he told me of an experience that he had while on the operating table. He said that Jesus visited him, and that Jesus held his hand and said, "Everything's going to be okay, and I will make you whole again." When he recovered from that surgery, he would tell anyone he could about this experience that he had had. And he continued to tell people all the way up until the point when he passed away. He told people even when he wasn't sure, because this event that happened for him in his body caused some ongoing health concerns and health conditions. And there were times when he said, "I heard Jesus say that he would make me whole again, and I don't know how that's going to happen, but I know that it's true because he was there and he held my hand." And so he would continue to tell people about this experience with Jesus, even when he said he wasn't sure how that all was going to work out. That is what happens on this Easter morning. Patty did a wonderful job with the children of imagining what that tension is like. These women go to the tomb to deal with a dead body. They've brought spices to anoint Jesus. But very quickly things go in a direction that they are not expecting, and an angel appears to them and tells them that Jesus is alive. And they at first doubt and are confused, but the angel reminds them of what Jesus had told them, and it says that when they remembered what he had said, suddenly it made sense to them, and they go and they tell the other disciples. And they go and tell, even though they must not be 100% sure what exactly is going on here. Soon enough, they will actually see the risen Christ, but in this moment, all they know is that they've seen an angel and that the body isn't there and that they've been told that he's alive. And they believe, and yet they undoubtedly have a little bit of unknown going on. Well, a little bit, that's an understatement, right? And then Peter, after hearing, he certainly has an unknown going on. He goes to look and he sees that the body isn't there, but it says that he simply leaves wondering what this all means, wondering what had happened. He doesn't seem even as sure as the women who had the experience of seeing the angel. Eventually, though, he will experience a vision and a moment of seeing the risen Christ. And he will go and tell as well. And we have a story to tell, too, of what Jesus has done in our life to provide new life and resurrection. In 2001, August, I was living in a tent in a state campground because I was looking for an apartment. I had worked a summer job and then was returning to a contract job that I did during the school year. And because I had moved from my summer job to this new contract job, I didn't have an apartment yet. I had been provided housing during the summer. So I was living in a tent in a state park, as one does. In the midst of that, starting back up with this job, I had an uncle who fell and was seriously ill, and we all went to the hospital to gather around him and his family. And he ended up passing away that night in August. The next morning, I went to my contract job that I had restarted up recently. I had worked it the previous year, but under a different boss, and I went in and told her that I would need a little bit of time off because my uncle had just died last night, and I knew that there would be a funeral coming up. She said that would be fine, and I went about my workday. But then at the end of my workday, she called me into her office, and she fired me. The official story is that I was fired for insubordination. I kind of like telling people this because it's a little bit funny. It's actually true, and I learned in that process that, so what happened was she was a new boss to me. She didn't do things the way the old boss did. This is a really good lesson for people in congregations, right? When you have a new pastor, I did what you shouldn't do, which is tell her that she should do things the way the old person did it. And she didn't like that. And so she fired me for insubordination because in front of other people, I told her directly that she was doing things wrong. Don't do that. I learned my lesson and I was fired. I was suddenly experiencing the grief of my uncle's death, experiencing the grief of the loss of a job, and I was technically homeless because I was living in a tent in a state park. I'm lucky compared to many people who experience homelessness because I was able to pack up my tent into the car that I had and drive to my parents' house where I stayed for a few weeks before I got a new job and back up on my feet. But I certainly experienced a lot of grief and death in that moment. And yet, out of that time in my life, I found resurrection. Because you see, when I was 12 years old, I had received a call to ministry, but my dad was a minister as well, and I said, no way am I doing that. And yet, in the midst of being fired from a job and wondering what on earth I was going to do now, living back at home, my dad said to me, there's a church that's looking for a youth director, and you had a call to ministry at one time. Maybe you should look into that. And I did, and I got a job as a youth director, and that church helped me find a roommate and an apartment so that I had a home to go to. And suddenly, I was on a new path, a new life. Prior to that, I thought I was going to be an actor, a professional actor, and yet that had largely led to dead ends. And as I moved toward doing ministry, suddenly doors opened. It truly was a new life, and only came to me through death and through the resurrection that is available through knowing Jesus Christ. Amen. I'd always kept my faith, but I'd shied away from being a worker in the Lord's harvest, and yet when I turned to that, I found new life. That's my story. And I have always loved the hymn, I love to tell the story, because I think that is who we are to be as Christian people who love to tell our story of new life and resurrection. And it has all kinds of looks. Resurrection isn't always a body no longer in the tomb, but walking around again. And it isn't always a new path after a dead-end path like I experienced. Maybe you've been able to overcome addiction because of the power of Jesus Christ and the new life that He gives. And you have a story to tell about the power of God to give new life and freedom from addiction. Maybe you left a bad relationship and found a new life with either the power to be on your own, or you found love with someone else, and that was new life for you, and you no longer had to sit in the death of that bad relationship, but Jesus brought you to a new relationship. Maybe you came through a huge illness like the man that I talked about in the beginning of my sermon, and you found the healing power of Jesus and new life. Maybe you've had a relationship that was restored after it was broken because of the power of forgiveness in Jesus Christ and the new life that can come from that. Maybe you did find a new career like I did. Maybe you gave of yourself in a sacrificial way that you never had before. and found new life in being able to give more, even though your previous life had been about trying to hold on to things. It's only possible through the power of Jesus Christ. Maybe you started something new, a ministry or a new way to care for people. Maybe you decided to start a nonprofit to help people in need. Maybe you started a project where you gathered items to help those who are in need. And you felt the call of Jesus in Matthew to reach out to those who need to be fed, or who are thirsty, who are sick, or who are in prison and need to be visited, who are naked and need to be clothed. Maybe you learned something new and found new life in that. Maybe you took a class or went back to school after being out of school for a while. That's ultimately what happened with me as well. I started as a youth pastor, and then in order to become a pastor, I had to go back to school. And that was also new life. And maybe you've experienced new life in that way as well, and it was only available because you knew Jesus Christ and you felt this call to try something new or to learn something new, and so you went to learn. Maybe you've taken steps to improve yourself, to move toward a surgery that is needed, or to get more fit, or to improve your cholesterol or blood pressure, like I need to. It's things that you can only do because of the new life available through Jesus Christ. That's what we as believers know. We think that before we know Jesus, we think that we can just do it on our own, that if we can just buckle ourselves down and put our hearts to it and our minds to it, that we can do it. But when we come to know resurrection, we realize that none of this new life is possible except through the power of God. Resurrection is all around us, and we've all experienced it. But it's also possible that you just don't know your story yet. You could be like Peter, who hears about resurrection and thinks that that sounds really good, and yet goes to the tomb and walks away wondering what has happened and unconvinced. Peter, again, will have his moment where he becomes convinced, but in that moment, he's not there yet. And maybe you're not there yet, and that's okay, too. We don't talk a lot about women in the Bible, unfortunately, and the Bible doesn't talk about them. I think it's funny. This story eventually does name the women in the story, but it starts by just saying the women went to the tomb. It only later seems to think it's important to name them. Women far often are ignored, excluded, or just sort of a side comment in the Bible. But on Easter, we're forced to pay attention to the women because they are the first ones who actually experience the resurrection. And we all need to want to be like the women who tell this story. That's what they immediately do. The disciples seem to be just sitting somewhere as far as we know. The women know exactly where to go. We're told that they go and tell the 11. It's like they're together and they're somewhere else. They're not at Jesus' tomb. That's where the women are. That's why they experience resurrection first. The men are just sitting somewhere. We need to want to be like these women whose immediate impulse is to go and tell the story of resurrection. But I want you to know that the Gospels are also written so that we see ourselves in the disciples. And so whether you see yourself as one of the women disciples or you see yourself like Peter, who maybe isn't yet sure of what their story is, you still are part of this resurrection story. And God is working in you. And even if you're not 100% sure what your resurrection story is yet, you still can tell your story. There is no way that Peter did not go away and talk to people about what he had seen to try to figure it out, right? It says that he went away wondering what had happened. We very rarely wonder alone. We wonder with other people. And we ask, is it possible what I experienced and what these women said to me? Is it true that this is what happened? We need women. We need people who will tell the story that they have heard already and seen already and experienced already. But we also need the people who ask, is it possible? And for those of us that have our stories of resurrection, we say, you bet it is. I have experienced resurrection. But the others of us that don't quite know our resurrection story yet, who haven't quite gotten there, we still have a story to tell. And I would invite you to be honest about where you struggle, because your story of struggle can help people too. One of the most amazing things in the process of me finally answering my call to ministry by becoming a youth director and then eventually going back to school and becoming a pastor is that as I tell people about it, it helps them as well. And I'm passionate about helping other people figure out their call to ministry. And I always tell them it's fine if it takes time. It took me 17 years from the time I was 12 until I finally was a pastor. And I always feel, not always, I originally felt like it was a waste of time because I thought I should have done this sooner, but I have come since to realize that it's part of the process and it's all part of my resurrection story. My story, even when I wasn't sure what exactly was going to happen, was a story of resurrection for other people. And so we all have a story to tell, and I love to tell the story. And we have to tell it. This morning, I ran across something really wonderful written by one of the bishops of the United Methodist Church. She's the bishop of the Baltimore Washington Conference. That's out east. That the Washington that's talked about there is Washington, D.C. Baltimore is in Maryland, obviously. Okay. And she says this. She says, what of the resurrection? She says, Christ is risen. Christ is risen indeed. We have gathered to end our fasts, resurrect our shouts of hallelujah, and fill our sacred spaces with the festive colors of Easter. And the question arises today, as it has arisen for generations before us, are we living the resurrection? And I would say, are we telling about it? What of the resurrection if the lives of real human beings are not transformed? What of the resurrection if the hungry remain without bread? What of the resurrection if the prisons of oppression yet overflow? What of the resurrection if the voiceless still cry out for justice against a cacophony of silent indifference? What of the resurrection if the marginalized are only pushed further into the margins? What of the resurrection if wars continue to ravage cities and souls without care of the cost? What of the resurrection if the blood of the innocent still runs warm down hot streets? What of the resurrection if the homeless cannot find shelter even under the archway of a sanctuary? What of the resurrection if the saved simply continue to color within the lines drawn by the hands of the privileged and powerful? What of the resurrection if the empty tomb simply becomes a tourist destination? Justice rose with all power. Mercy rose with all power. Reconciliation rose with all power. The resurrection has power. That power has been imparted to us. Through that power, how have we been changed? With that power, what have we transformed? The resurrection redeems, restores, repairs. May we live, and again, I would say, tell the resurrection. We have to tell. That's the power of the resurrection. It drives us to tell. Peter, even though he doesn't immediately tell, when he does experience the risen Christ, he tells as well. And so today, I want you to share the story of resurrection in your life. At Thanksgiving, my family has a tradition of sharing what they're thankful about around the table. And today, I would imagine that many of you will gather with others to eat. And I want you to take the opportunity to talk with one another about your resurrection stories. This is the Easter tradition that I want to start, loving to tell our stories, even when we've heard it again and again and again, loving to tell our stories, willing to share our doubts. God is at work in you. God is at work in the midst of all of us. And God is all about new life. New life coming from what we perceive as lost and broken and dead. God can redeem all of that. So if you're someone that has experienced that redemption, tell your story. And if you're someone still waiting for it, tell your story. Be like the women and be like the other disciples who all eventually tell their story. We are to be people that tell the story of Jesus in our lives because we are full of new life, and new life is all around us in big and little ways. And so go and tell of new life. Amen.